It started on what should have been an ordinary Saturday morning. The sun was just rising over my suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns. My property was set back a little farther than most, with a main house in front and a smaller guest house tucked behind it. That guest house had always been a source of pride for me. Over the years, I renovated it carefully, making it into a cozy and private space where visiting family, friends, or even renters could stay comfortably. After weeks of planning, I finally decided to install a modern smart lock on the guest house door. It wasn't anything flashy, just a secure lock with a keypad and mobile app control. My reasons were simple. I wanted to make things easier for guests and more secure for myself. No more fumbling with spare keys or worrying about who had copies. It was a responsible, straightforward upgrade. But apparently, not everyone saw it that way. Enter Karen. She was a neighbor everyone knew about, the type who made herself the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. People whispered stories about her constant complaints. Too many cars parked on the street, kids playing too loudly, even criticizing how neighbors decorated their lawns. She thrived on confrontation. What made her especially notorious, though, was her sharp tongue and her bias. More than one neighbor had hinted that Karen's complaints had less to do with rules and more to do with the color of someone's skin. The morning I started installing the smart lock, I noticed Karen peering from across the fence. Her eyes lingered longer than normal, her expression twisted in suspicion. I ignored her, focusing on my work, tightening screws and syncing the lock to my phone. But I could feel her watching, the way you can sense someone glaring even when you don't look directly at them. By midday, the installation was complete. I stepped back, proud of the sleek new lock. That was when Karen made her move. She stormed down the sidewalk toward my driveway, her voice sharp and accusatory. Though I stayed calm, it was obvious what she was implying. She acted like I had no right to make improvements to my own property. Her tone dripped with hostility. Her words twisted into something more personal, more venomous than a simple concern about a lock. I refused to argue. Instead, I turned and walked back inside, leaving her standing there. I thought that was the end of it. I couldn't have been more wrong. A short while later, I heard sirens. The sound was faint at first, but quickly grew louder until 2 police cars pulled into the cul-de-sac. My heart sank as I realized what Karen had done. She had called 911. When the officers stepped out, they weren't rushing as if it were an emergency. They looked confused, almost hesitant. Still, the fact that police were there meant Karen had painted me as some kind of criminal. From my window, I watched her animated gestures as she spoke to the officers, pointing toward my guest house, waving her arms dramatically. Her face was flushed with indignation, her voice carrying across the street. Neighbors started to gather, some standing in their driveways, others peeking through curtains. Everyone knew Karen's reputation, but seeing her escalate things to this level left even them stunned. The officers eventually approached my door. I stepped outside, paperwork in hand, fully prepared to show that I owned the property and that installing a smart lock on my guest house was not only legal but entirely within my rights. The officers seemed caught in the middle, aware of how ridiculous the situation was, but also bound to follow up on the call. Karen, meanwhile, hovered nearby, arms crossed, glaring as if she had uncovered some grand crime. In that moment, I realized this was not going to be the last confrontation. Karen had crossed a line, and she wasn't going to stop here. What she didn't know was that she had just set herself on a path that would backfire spectacularly. This was only the beginning of the chaos to come. The officer stood in my driveway, shifting uncomfortably as Karen's voice carried on behind them. She kept repeating the same accusations, claims that I was doing something shady with the guest house, that strange people would be coming and going now that I had installed a smart lock. Her words weren't about the lock at all. They were laced with suspicion about who I allowed on my property, about my background, about the kind of people she assumed I associated with. Her tone left little doubt about her real motivation. The officers listened politely, but it was clear they weren't buying into her hysteria. They asked me a few basic questions. Was this my property? Did I have tenants? Was there any dispute with the HOA? I calmly showed them the property deed, proof of ownership, and even the packaging from the lock I had just installed. Everything was legal, above board, and painfully ordinary. The officers nodded, exchanged looks, and eventually told Karen there was nothing criminal happening here. But Karen wasn't satisfied. As they walked back to their cars, she grew louder, her words edged with desperation. She accused me of changing the character of the neighborhood and suggested the guest house could become unsafe if I kept renting it out to the wrong people. Neighbors who had gathered began whispering, shaking their heads. Some even muttered under their breath that she had gone too far this time. After the police left, I hoped the matter was over. But the very next day, Karen took things further. I came home from running errands to find her standing on my property, yes, inside my fenced yard, snapping pictures of the guest house door. She was trespassing without hesitation, acting like she had the authority to inspect what I was doing. I confronted her immediately, but she refused to leave, claiming she was documenting evidence for the HOA. That was when I realized this wasn't just a one-off act of paranoia. Karen was determined to build a case against me, no matter how flimsy or invasive her methods were. I began documenting everything. I saved every letter she slipped into my mailbox, every video clip from my security cameras that showed her stepping onto my property without permission if she wanted to escalate. I was ready to protect myself. A few days later, I received an official-looking notice from the HOA citing community safety concerns about the guest house. The wording sounded suspiciously like Karen's language, as though she had written the letter herself and pushed the board into mailing it. The notice demanded I remove unauthorized modifications and warned that failure to comply could result in fines. The problem for them was simple. My guest house and its lock weren't even under HOA jurisdiction. My property was partially exempt from their control due to its age and zoning. They had limited authority, and certainly none over what kind of lock I chose to put on my own door. Karen, however, didn't care about rules or boundaries. She kept pushing. One evening, I caught her pacing near the guest house, phone in hand, as if she were waiting for someone. Minutes later, another police car pulled up. She had called 911 again, this time claiming there was unauthorized occupancy in the guest house. The officers quickly realized it was another baseless call, but I could see the frustration in their faces. They were tired of being used as pawns in her vendetta. This was no longer just harassment. It was becoming a dangerous pattern. A false police report might seem like a nuisance at first, but repeated calls could escalate into something far worse. Karen wanted to paint me as a threat, to isolate me in the neighborhood, to intimidate me into backing down. But she had underestimated me. With evidence piling up and neighbors beginning to witness her outrageous behavior firsthand, I knew it was time to take action. I wasn't going to sit back and let her drag my name, my property, and my peace of mind through the mud. The next step would change everything, not just for Karen, but for the HOA board that had enabled her. Here's the final chapter written in a medium length to wrap up the story. 3. By the time Karen called 911 for the third time, even the police had run out of patience. Each officer who showed up already knew the situation, and their reports clearly reflected that her accusations were baseless. They warned her that filing false reports could have consequences, but Karen just scoffed, convinced she was protecting the neighborhood. What she didn't realize was that her arrogance had given me exactly what I needed. I compiled every piece of evidence. The security footage of her trespassing, copies of the HOA letters that echoed her language, and the police reports documenting her repeated false claims. With my lawyer's help, I filed a formal complaint not only with the police department, but also with the county court. Trespassing, harassment, and abuse of emergency services. Karen had crossed every line. The hearing that followed was short, but devastating for her. The footage of her walking onto my property, without permission, left no room for excuses. The judge was blunt, stating that her behavior was not only disruptive, but also dangerous. She was fined for misuse of 911 and given a restraining order that barred her from stepping foot on my property again. The HOA board, embarrassed for backing her antics, was forced to issue a written statement admitting they had no authority over my guest house. When the news spread, the neighborhood's opinion shifted overnight. Some residents who had once avoided Karen began speaking openly about her long history of bullying. Others quietly apologized to me for not stepping in sooner. Karen, once loud and overbearing, became noticeably quiet. Her reputation was ruined, her influence shattered. As for me, life returned to normal. My smart lock stayed right where I had installed it, and the guest house became what I had always intended, a safe, private space for visitors. The difference now was that I had peace, free from constant harassment. Karen had tried to control me through fear and prejudice, but in the end, her obsession had only exposed her own ugliness. And in the silence that followed, I finally felt the neighborhood was mine again, calm, secure, and no longer under the shadow of Karen's chaos.